Welcome to Excel magic trick number 1424. Hey, if you want to download this Excel workbook, either the finished file or the start file so you can follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, we want to talk about calculating average and moving average at different granularities. And we want to see how to do it with DAX formulas in the data model and Excel formulas. Now, what is granularity? It just means the scale or level of the detail. For us, it's what size is the period. Now, if we're going to make an average calculation, we have to decide what numbers go into the average function. Is it simply going to be the transaction total, which means each line in this table, that number right there goes into the average calculation? Or do we need a different level? Do we need to sum up all of the daily totals before we make our average calculation? That means we actually have to go through the data set and not use each individual line amount, but find every single profit on 1/31/2017 added up, and then do that for every single date in the period. Once we get those daily totals, then we put those into the average calculations. Similarly, you could do it for month or quarter or year. For us, we're going to do transaction totals. That means just individual line items, and then the daily total. Now, here's our pivot table with our DAX formula for transactional average profit, and then transactional moving average profit for the last 90 days. And we'll make a line chart. We'll do the same calculations with Excel formulas. And then we will do the daily average profit. That's where we have to add up the daily totals before making our average calculation. And then a moving average over the past 90 days, both with DAX and with Excel formulas. And down here, here's our formulas for our transactional granularity and our daily granularity. Now, we want to go over to the start file. All right, over here in the start file, we have our profit table with transactions. We have our date table. I've converted both of these to Excel tables and imported them into the data model. We can go look. On the Power Pivot tab, click on Manage Data Model. Here's the F units. Here's the date. Notice I've already hidden some of these columns because I do not want them to show up in the pivot table field list. If we go over to Diagram View, here's our F units. We're going to add a bunch of measures. These will show up there later. Notice we can see date and month are grayed out. That means they're hidden. We're actually going to go hide all of these. Watch this. I can do this here or over in Data View. I'm going to click on the first one, Shift, click on the last one to highlight them all, right-click, Hide from Client Tool. We only want to drag and drop the measures into the pivot table. So we're preventing these fields from showing up in our pivot table field list. Let's go back over to Data View. We'll come back over to F units and create our formulas. Notice that they're all grayed out. We're certainly allowed to make DAX calculations on these columns even though they're hidden from the data model. Now, we're going to start off by making two basic DAX calculations. We're going to need total profit and average profit. So in one cell in the measure grid, I'm going to click, come up to the formula bar, type total profit, colon, equal sign, and then the sum function. F to get to the F units table, down arrow to profit, tab, close parentheses, and enter. There's our DAX formula. We're definitely going to add some number formatting. Now we come down below, click up in the formula bar, average, colon, equal sign, average. Just like over in Excel, average is the DAX formula you'll use if you have a simple column you want to average. F, down arrow to F units, profit, tab, close parentheses, enter. We'll add some number formatting. I love this. It's so much better than a standard pivot table because that number formatting will follow this formula around. Now, these are both for the transaction level. Let's go back over to our Excel sheet. I've already started the pivot table. You can see here I've dragged month to the row, year to the filter, and filtered because we only want to make our calculations for 2018. Now, since this is going to be our transactional pivot table, I want to drag and drop average, but actually I want to rename this. Watch this. This is a great trick. I don't need to go back over to the data model. I can right-click, edit measure. And this opens up the measure dialog box. I'm going to call this measure transactional average profit. I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to drag this down to the values. And that's our average profit based on each one of the transactions for each one of the months. Now, if we're going to do this in Excel, we can do this. We do have to put the upper and lower limit. And then we simply use the AVERAGEIFS function. Now, AVERAGEIFS allows us to make an average calculation on a column of numbers with one or more conditions. Average range, that's the profit. And this is an Excel table, so I simply click at the top when I see my black downward pointing arrow. I click, and that puts our table formula nomenclature. And just like in DAX, table name and then field name in square brackets, comma, criteria range. Well, we have to look through the date column and make sure all of the dates are greater than or equal to the lower and less than or equal to the upper. So I click on date. There's my date, comma. Now, the comparative operator over here has to be in double quotes, greater than or equal to, two separate characters, and double quote, and you have to join it. And I'm going to left arrow to the lower, comma. Criteria range 1, I click. I Control C. I click on criteria range 2, Control V, comma. And now we have to less than or equal to the upper arrow. And that's it. Close parentheses, Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell, hit F2. All the ranges are looking good. Notice we get the exact same amounts. Now let's click back in our pivot table. Now we need to do a moving average. And here's how the DAX formula is working. When this formula gets to this row in the pivot table, January is associated with all of the individual dates for January in the date table. That date table is filtered down to just those dates. The filter flows across the relationship to the F units table, filtering down just to the profits for January. And then the calculation makes its average calculation on just those amounts. But here's the deal. How do we get our DAX formula, since it's seen the filter context over here in the pivot table? How are we going to get our formula to see 90 days back? We'll use calculate and establish a new set of valid dates. Now I'm going to Alt-Tab to come over to the measured grid in our data model. Click in a cell. Click up on the formula bar. I'm going to type transactional moving average profit last 90 days, colon, equal sign. And the function that can change the filter context is C-tab, calculate. Now our expression, we need to change the filter context for that actual transactional average profit that we already created. Now watch this. This is a great trick. I can click on that cell, and it puts the proper syntax for our measure, square brackets, and the name of the measure. Now, comma, filter. This is where we get to change the filter context. And what we want to do is calculate with a complete list of valid dates. So the date table can filter down to just those dates. That means end of the month, 90 days back. The way we can do that is with the dates in period function. The dates, it needs the date column. So I'm going to type DD down arrow to the date column, tab, comma, the start date. Even though we're going to take the last date, we're going to say start date, last date of the period, and then go minus 90 for number of intervals. So I'm going to say last date. And I simply have to put the date column, because the filter context will flow in, exposing just the dates for that period. And last date will get the last date in that period, comma, minus 90. Now, when I put minus 90, this function is smart enough to include this last date. When we get over to our Excel formula, we'll have to do something slightly different, comma, and then the interval is day, close parentheses. What dates in period does is it provides the full valid list of dates. So calculate can calculate transactional average profit over those days, meaning all the transactional amounts that fit those days. Close parentheses, enter. Now I'm going to add some number formatting. Come over, expose the column, Alt-Tab. Now we can drag our formula down to values. Now I'm immediately going to highlight pivot table. Field names come up to home, wrap text. And there we go. That 280 as compared to our 305. That's for April 2018. This is for last day of the month all the way 90 days back. Now let's see how to do this with an Excel formula. Well, actually, I'm going to totally cheat. It's similar to this formula. We still need a lower and upper, but I'm going to cheat and copy this in edit mode. Control-C, escape. Right here, F2, Control-V. Now, if I say greater than or equal to the lower here, well, actually, it needs to be much lower than that. It needs to go back into 2017. So I'm going to double-click that. And I don't really want the lower. I want the upper as a relative cell reference minus. And I want to click on 90. But if I go back 90 days, it'll go one day too far because I want to include the actual 131. So I'm going to hit F4 to lock it first and then +1. So that'll go include that day, 89 days back. That is now the lower limit. Properly, our upper limit is still that upper limit right there. So in order for a transactional amount to be included here, it's got to be greater than or equal to 90 days back and less than or equal to the upper. Control-Enter, double-click, and send it down. And we get exactly the same amounts as we did with our DAX formula. Now let's make our line chart. I'm going to click in a single cell, go up to Insert. Here's the line chart. We want a line chart. We have equidistance, horizontal categories, and then two different numbers we want to plot. So I'm going to come over here. I think I'm going to use the first one. Click. Now, I don't want to see these field filter labels, so I'm going to right-click, hide all field buttons on chart. I'm going to click on the legend, Control-1 to open up the task pane for our chart element, and click top. And so it's up at the top. I'm going to close that. And that's looking pretty good right like that. I'm not going to put a title on this because if I'm just analyzing this and looking here and here, it's self-evident. Now I'm going to click off to the side. There is our chart. We can see the orange one is the moving average. Sometimes it's below, sometimes it's above our actual transactional average amount for the particular month. All right, now let's go down, and I'm not going to create charts for all of them. It would be exactly the same chart. Let's go down, and we want to talk about calculating the daily totals before we make our average calculation. Alt-Tab. Now, here's the cool thing about DAX. Is we're not going to use the straight average function. And I'm going to click up in the formula bar, type daily average profit, := sign. We're not going to use the straight average function because that would be for a simple column. We want to use AVERAGEX. Any of the X functions are iterators. They allow us to iterate over a particular table as if we had created a helper column. Now, remember, our goal is to get the total for each day and then average. The way we're going to do that is we're going to use the DDate table. Now, the filter context for each month, January, February, March, will flow in. So when we're in January, DDate will be filtered down to the individual days for January, comma. Now, the expression, remember, we actually need to add for each day first. So that's where we're going to use our total profit. So I'm going to click down here. Now, total profit sees the filter context from the pivot table. So right now, it would just get total profit for January. But guess what? It actually needs to be able to iterate over each day for January in the DDate table. That's what X means, to iterate. Takes an expression, iterates over a table and makes a calculation for each row. Now, notice we actually referenced a measure. And anytime we put a measure into another measure, there's a hidden calculate function right there. That's what allows that calculation to not only see filter context from the pivot table, but also the row context. Calculate takes the row context and transitions or converts it into filter context. That way, that total profit can calculate for each row the daily total. If you put a sum function like we actually saw a few videos ago, 1419, if you put a straight sum function here, you actually have to explicitly list the calculate function to do context transition, row context into filter context. That total profit will get the total for each day, and then AVERAGEIFS will average those amounts. Now I'm going to enter. And there we have our daily average profit. We want to come up and add some number formatting. Alt-Tab. There's our daily average profit. We're going to drag it down to values. And there is our calculation. In each cell, AVERAGEX, the date column, and total profit. First, calculated the total for each day, and then calculated the average. And it did it for each month. Now, the DAX formula, even though conceptually it's difficult to understand because of context, transition, and hidden calculates, when we get to an Excel formula, the actual formula is much more difficult. We saw that AVERAGEX just required that we use the date column and total profit. But we still can do this in Excel. Now, the trick is we still have to materialize a table of every single day for this particular month. But we're given only the begin and end date. Once we materialize the list of complete dates for each period, we then have to use that in an OR logical test to calculate the total sales for each day. Once we have all those numbers, then we put that inside the average function. We're going to start first with trying to figure out how to calculate a list of all the dates for a particular period. So equal sign, left arrow, and I'm going to join it to, in double quotes, a colon, and then join to the upper. Now, that colon has a special meaning in Excel. Of course, it means go from some starting point in a range to an ending point. Now, my cursor's at the end. If I F9 to evaluate this, look at that. It actually has the serial number dates, start date, end date with a colon. Now, Excel can understand this as a range of values, but because it's a number, it's as if we had all of the cells from row 43,101 to 43,131. That is a lot of cells. Control Z, but we could still get this to work. We first have to convert that range as a text back to a range. And the perfect function for that is indirect. Returns the reference specified by a text string. Tab. Come to the end, close parentheses. Now, if I try to evaluate this, I hit the F9 key. It's very polite. It says, I cannot display more than 8,192 characters in a cell. And that is because there's just too many references in that range. But it is a valid reference, so now we can wrap the row function. Now remember, there's only 31 rows there, right? So row looks through a range of values and just returns the row. Even though there's many repeats, when we close parentheses and our cursor at the end, when we F9, look at that. It returns one of each, what it thinks is a row, but for us, those are serial number dates. That's how we materialize the complete list of dates inside a formula. Now, this is definitely Control Z, an array formula. We're doing operations with the indirect and row function on more than one item. In essence, an array of items. So eventually, we're going to have to enter this with a special keystroke for array formulas. But now, the next trick is we have all the dates. How in the world do we add all the sales? Well, luckily, the SUMIFS function is perfect for either running an AND logical test or, like we have, an OR logical test. I need to add up the sales for every single one of these days. Sum range, F units, I see it in my drop-down tab, square bracket, down arrow to profit, close square bracket, comma. So the sum range, we have that. Criteria range, well, I don't want that. That's the actual criteria. So I'm going to FU tab, square bracket. I see date, I tab, close square bracket, comma. Now, criteria argument expects a single criteria. We saw up in our earlier formula where we put greater than or equal to a particular date. But now we know that's a list of all the dates. But no problem. Anytime you put more than one item into the criteria one, it'll run an OR logical test, meaning as it goes through the columns over there, picking out the profits to add, it will say, is this a particular day or a particular other day or a particular other day? Not only that, but since we gave it 31 dates, SUMIFS is programmed to deliver 31 answers. And this is using SUMIFS to do an OR logical test. Now, I see the row here went away. I guess when I hit tab there. I have to have the row function inside of INDIRECT. Now I come to the end. Close parentheses. And watch this. When I hit the F9 key to evaluate, there are the total profits for each day. Now we can put all these values into the average function. Control Z. Now we simply come up after the equal sign, average, tab, come to the end, close parentheses. Now this has got all sorts of array calculations in it, including the SUMIFS doing an array calculation because it's spitting out multiple answers. So we have to very carefully enter this array formula with Control Shift and enter. We immediately go up to the formula bar and verify that the curly brackets have been put in. Those curly brackets are Excel telling you it understood and calculated this as an array formula. Now I'm going to double click and send it down. I'm going to come to the last cell and hit F2 to verify that all the cell references and ranges are correct. Now I do not want to hit enter here because then I would be putting an array formula in without Control Shift Enter. I could use Control Shift Enter, but instead I'll just use Escape to revert back to whatever was in the cell before I put it in edit mode. Guess what? The logic for how both formulas are calculated is the same. We had to materialize the table, calculate the totals for each day, and then calculate an average. Now let's go back over to DAX because our next calculation is going to be daily moving average profits for last 90 days. Alt-Tab. Click in a cell, up in the formula bar. There's the name of our measure, colon, equal sign. We're still going to use the AVERAGEIFS function, but we need to calculate a daily total over something different than the filter context. So if you think of January, we can't just put the date column, because then when the filter context flows in, it'll give us just the days for January. And we need the last day in January back 90 days. But guess what? This says table right here. We can put a table function. We can actually use dates in period. Remember, dates in period will deliver a valid list of dates. So DD, we're going to down arrow to the date column. That date column right now has, if we were in the January cell, the days for January. Comma, but from those days in January, I need to calculate the start date, so I use last date. DD, down arrow, date. So last date will look at the filter context and give us, for January, the end of January. Comma. We need to go back 90 days, so I type minus 90, comma, and our interval will be day, so tab, close parentheses. That table right there is providing from the date table a valid list. For January, it'd be January 31st all the way back 90 days. So all those days, we now can iterate over them, comma. The expression, square bracket, our total profit. And that will work. Close parentheses and enter. Immediately add some number formatting. Alt-Tab. Now we can drag our daily moving average profit last 90 days down below daily average profit, and there you go. And you can make a line chart to display these. We did that earlier in the video. I'm going to highlight those. Home, wrap text, boom, there it is. Now, for our Excel formulas, well, our formula we did over here, F2, it's almost exactly the same. I'm going to highlight this, Control-C, Escape. Click in this cell, F2, Control-V. Instead of starting at the beginning of January, I need to start at the end of the month minus 90. And I'm going to go up and get my criteria I put in the cell up here, F4 to lock that. And just as we did before, that goes back 90, but we need to go back 89. So I add 1. And that's the only difference. Control-Shift and Enter. Double click and send it down. Now notice, that took a while to calculate. Array formula is working on 11,000 rows in our table over here. You could see visually that that took a while to calculate. The DAX will definitely calculate faster. Now just to see, for an example, I'm going to hit F2, come over here, and in criteria, I'm going to hit the F9 key. And you can see we get a much bigger materialized array of dates. Those are all the days from 90 days backwards to the end of January. Now I'm going to click Escape. Wow, that was a lot of fun with not only DAX and Excel for our transactional amounts, and DAX and Excel for daily amounts. Over in the data model, we did total profits. Then we did transactional average profit. We had a single column, so we just used average. Then we used calculate to alter the filter context to go back 90 days to get a valid list of dates. Then we used row context and filter context using AVERAGEX to calculate first total profits for each day, and then the average of all those amounts. And then we used AVERAGEX and the dates in period actually as our table to create the table we needed to iterate over. And then we iterated total profit. Back over here in Excel, our spreadsheet functions, we used AVERAGEIFS with an upper and lower limit. Here, the upper and lower limit, where the lower limit was altered by 89 days. And then down here, we did an awesome array formula here, SUMIFS and row and indirect inside of average. And then here, we just altered that lower limit. All right, that was a lot of fun with Excel spreadsheet functions, DAX, and granularity for average and moving average calculations. All right, we'll see you next video.